Hopefully in all the good ways. Okay. Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Jamie Favors. I'm the Partnerships Coordinator with NASA's Earth Science Division, and along with my friend Mega, we will be your conveners for this site event. So we're going to spend the next hour roughly speaking and sharing a lot about public-private partnerships relevant to Earth observations. As you can tell, this becomes a bit of a call to action, starting with the site event, leading into Industry Week later, where Geo Week overall for 2019 is really focused on this idea: is what are all those potential roles for the public-private sector interactions when it comes to Earth observations, societal benefit, and the application of these data, building into tools that we work so hard on. We are incredibly fortunate to have a pretty amazing panel, if I do say so myself, that have come together to share a little bit about their previous experiences and talk through a little bit about that later on. Also, if you're curious more about what NASA has done with public-private partnerships, particular to Earth observations, I have a talk on Thursday at 11:50, so I'll keep it short today. But actually, I'm going to go and hand it over to Mega right now to talk a little bit about Geospatial Media, her company.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, and thank you to all for joining us during the lunch hours. I'm Megha from Geospatial Media and Communications. I know that some of you know about us, but for the benefit of the others, Geospatial Media is a think tank on geospatial technologies. We've been around for more than 20 years, and our focus is basically to increase the use and awareness of the value and impact of geospatial information for various societal and economic benefit purposes. From the public-private partnership point of view, Geospatial Media has been working extensively, both the private sector as well as the government organizations, not only from the national mapping agencies and space agencies, but various other user industries. And recently we have started a campaign which is focusing on development of geospatial information knowledge network. And we are looking at developing collaborations and partnerships, especially between the private sector and the public sector in doing that. So what we learn from this group will feed into the study that we are doing, and this will really help us to enrich our own understanding and knowledge. And now I hand over back to Jamie to take this session further.
Great. So back to our panel. We decided in the interest of time that we won't go through introductions each time. Since we only have an hour together, they clearly can let you know all the relevant information about themselves as we move through. What we've done here with the panel is we've tried to get all points of view, or at least as many as we possibly could within this discussion. So we'll hear from regional groups, we'll hear from federal groups, we'll also hear from one of the top 5 largest companies in the world that has started to take particular interest within Earth observations. So we've asked them to share a little bit about themselves, any relevant information about public-private partnerships that they've been involved in, to highlight a few successes and challenges. This is really where the learning within the geo community starts to take off. Where have they seen things that work particularly well that might be useful for you? Where have they encountered some issues along the way that might be good for you to know ahead of time as you start to explore these opportunities? As well as each one of them we've asked to wrap up, or we can come back to this in the discussion. What are maybe those big opportunities when it comes to Earth observations and the application, where we see a particular opportunity with public and private partnership to be a vehicle and have a role within making that happen? So with that, the very good fortune, I think Basanta will be our first speaker on the panel. So Basanta, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, Megha. I'm very, very happy to be among the fellow panelists and this session to share some of my thoughts. Just to introduce myself, I'm from ICMOD, International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, based in Kathmandu, Nepal. It's a regional intergovernmental organization representing 8 countries in the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. In terms of geo, we also represent Himalayan Geo, the sub-regional constellation of a geo in promoting Earth observation in the Himalayan region. We are also a survey hub node supported by NASA and USAID in terms of using Earth observation and the geospatial technologies. In terms of public-private partnership, as we see the tremendous growth of technology and innovation and in terms of solutions, almost maturing to a state where we see different products and services with the end users and the customers, with the weather services, with the agri services and others. There is an increasing interest of a public and private partnership. And at ICMOD, we have also a number of that sort of example I would like to share. One with a Google Earth, with Google Earth Engine, we are working together in terms of providing the land cover time series data of the entire Himalayan region, and we are helping governments in Afghanistan, Myanmar, Bangladesh, and Nepal to use some of these information services. For example, the forestry sector, some of this in a RED Plus, reduce emission for deforestation and degradation, RED Plus in mechanism and others. I also would like to cite another example, perhaps this is the initial step. With Amazon through Geo, we are also gotten the cloud services to serve some of the regional drought information services, especially looking at some of the agriculture sectors and the agri sectors, where we are trying to foster that sort of a collaboration. Not to mention here, again, with the Microsoft AI for Earth initiative and technology for social impact, we are also making some headway in terms of some collaboration to provide some products and services, so to speak. I also would like to cite some of the local example. In Nepal, community forestry is one of the key examples, in terms of reforestation, in terms of conservation. And recently, government of Nepal has announced in terms of insurance industry to provide in terms of, to look at from the forest fire and the degradation, So looking at some of the Earth observation satellite data to provide to an insurance industry is some of the initial step in terms of our collaboration and so forth. Likewise, in the hydropower sector, in the Himalayan region, this is very, very potential in terms of the large hydropower plants. But again, in terms of glacier melting and the climate change, what are the impacts of the glacier lake outburst floods that are, hazardous or that are very much, risky for hydropower plants? So we have worked with the Statkraft from Norway, to look at some of the hydropower potential hazards from the glacier lake outburst floods and so forth. So I think what I would like to say is there are an increasing level of interest from both from the private sector and the public sector, and I think to create that sort of a magic sauce in terms of balance, in terms of what's in it for in that partnership, both from the public sector and the private sector, is very, very important. Lastly, I also would like to cite one very example, perhaps a painful reminder in terms of catastrophic disaster in a Nepal earthquake 2015 and 25th April, where a lot of geo community or Earth observation community, NASA, space agencies and others providing enormous amount of satellite data and digital globe, Airbus and many others. Now to provide this sort of information to a government, to a first responders, ICMOD had worked together with number of these private sector satellite providers and working with a government to provide very unified kind of information to first responder in terms of disaster recovery and response as such. Some of the challenges that we also see in terms of such partnership is sometimes if we do not have a good workflow system in terms of utilizing such Earth observation in your system, there are also challenges in terms of sustainability, challenges in terms of technical ability to use by the governments and others. There are enormous challenges in the context of that. But what we see on the horizon is perhaps we are in a threshold in terms of fostering that sort of a collaborative effort. And what I see in a geo community and the participation of the big giant from the private sector, there's an enormous opportunity for us to leapfrog to provide that sort of information services to an end user community through public-private partnership. I'll stop here, James.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Rolando Campo. Sorry for my cough. I'm a little bad from my throat. I come from ECLAC. I'm a statistician, but I used to work my past work was at INEGI as a member of the board, and I was responsible of the environmental and geographical area in the National Institute for Statistics and Geography in Mexico. And what I want to say is about the question that you asked us is about the public-private partnership. When we began this process of UNGGIM in 2011, you know, in the United Nations, so we create regional organizations, one for the Americas, one for Europe, one from Arab states, one from Africa, and one from Asia Pacific. And I was the president of the UNGGIM Americas. And during that period, we made a partnership with a private company, Geospatial Media Communication, and we took the opportunity to make for 7 years, even now, the last 2 years that I was at the Institute, the meetings, the regional meetings in the continent for UNGGIM, and to know all the process of geospatial information in the countries. The collaboration we did, the private sector with Geospatial Media and other companies that participate in the process and with capacity training in these regional meetings was very important for us and for the session. One example that we have in 2017 is that when we have that meeting in Mexico, a hurricane crossed for some island of the Caribbean. I don't remember if it was Dominica or another one. And so one company that was in the exhibition area, Planet, so they proposed to open their platform just to give, to let the countries to take the satellite images to see the damage in their countries that was happening. So with this collaboration in the private project, so it was very important for us. Another example that we have is for the rapid, during that process, when I was at INEGI, we have a project for the Caribbean countries to strengthen the capacity building in the Caribbean countries with 18 islands in the Caribbean, including the biggest one and the smallest one, Cuba, Haiti, República Dominicana. And we acquired some satellite imagery from Rapid Eye. And in fact, they donate another ones for another year. So we have for 1 year, and they donate another ones for another year, just to create this big hub that we put it in the university in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, the West Indies University. To give the continuity of this project, we create a technical committee with private companies and with private university that belongs to the Caribbean countries, that were in the Caribbean countries, and that work for the Caribbean countries. Another thing is that so that we have as good practice with the private public-private partnership is The last ministerial meeting was held in Mexico City. And it was, we could do it with Geo, with a collaboration with INEGI, Geo, and Global and Geospatial Communication. We made an agreement between the three of us, and we made this collaboration to bring all the countries to have this meeting, the same one that we are facing here in Australia. We have it in Mexico with the collaboration of the private companies. And one opportunity now that I'm working at ECLAC, we want to incorporate all the geospatial side in the statistical side. So I'm the director of the statistics division in ECLAC, but since 2 years ago, we pushed from the countries to ask for ECLAC to have a geospatial specialist, regional advisor in geospatial information in ECLAC. So we have one, and now our proposal is to create a Geostat portal just to incorporate in the geospatial information to work with for example, with NASA, to incorporate the information, the Landsat information, just to incorporate the things that, like, for example, land cover, that we would like to do it for. We did it for Mexico, and we would like to do it. Our proposal is to have one for the Caribbean countries and for the Latin American countries, and with these agreements, so we can work to have and provide opportunities to the Latin American countries. Another one is that we began a process with Trimble just to begin a process for capacity building in the Caribbean countries and the Latin American countries. Just with them, we have the first meeting with the Latin American and the regional responsible of Trimble, and the idea is just to begin this process with them. So this is the way that we think that we have to ensure that the private partnership with the government and private companies must continue in a more strongly way. Thank you.
Okay. So, hi everyone, I'm Arji Cavada. I support NASA's Earth Science Division, the Applied Sciences Program in particular, and I'm also the Executive Secretary for the Earth Observations for Sustainable Development Goals, a GEO initiative. And so I think talking about this GEO initiative in particular is a great example of a collaboration among many different organizations, both in the public and non-public domain. And so the initiative itself, among many other GEO work program activities, is a great example of how government agencies, along with non-government organizations, academia, initiatives that represent civil society, and NGOs are coming together to really identify creative ways for demonstrating how Earth observations can be used to support countries in monitoring progress and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so within the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, partnerships between public and non-public sector have been highlighted as key in helping address data gaps and help utilize advances in science, innovation, and technology, leveraging expertise that exists in those domains in both the public and non-public sector. And so one good example of such a partnership and collaboration is between different GEO initiatives, such as this EU for SDG initiative, as well as other thematic activities that focus on urban, sustainable urbanization and sustainable cities and communities, such as Human Planet initiative within GEO, with the UN, and in particular UN Habitat, that is an agency focusing on helping develop global methodologies to assist countries in monitoring how they're progressing toward a more sustainable sustainable cities and communities. And so UN Habitat, with some of these geo activities in collaboration with NGOs like Conservation International, which is a good example, have been working together to help both develop methods that are consistent and can be applied at country and even down to the city level across the world, but also helping develop tools that can support countries in producing indicators that monitor these changes in land use within urban contexts, and also can help them combine information from space-based observations with census data and other types of ancillary information. And so this is a great example where different expertise and capabilities are being leveraged to really help advance the progress in achieving these SDGs at different levels, from global to regional, national, and even at the city level. It's really important to, the other thing that I wanted to highlight in this example is that in particular, we've seen that, for example, UN Habitat has been collaborating at country level with space agencies as well as statistical offices and NGOs to understand how they can be bringing the local context and specific local use cases into and feeding this into the global framework to help really provide and bring this local context and address assumptions and biases. So helping really bring this bottom-up approach through this collaboration. When thinking about public and private partnerships, especially for the SDGs, and looking at developing new ideas and partnerships, I think that it is really important to leverage existing ones as well as practitioner communities to ensure that efforts are not duplicated, and to also make sure that things are designed in a way that aim to be inclusive and to really help address everyone, making sure that even the most vulnerable populations are addressed and they are not left behind. Another item that can be further addressed through these public, non-public partnerships is to really see how NGOs and civil society can focus and engage even more in playing this critical role of watchdog function and ensuring that the products and services that come out from public, non-public partnerships can really be used for societal good and applied in this way. In thinking about, since we are at the Geo Week, I think the Geo and the UN and other international initiatives have a unique role to play in terms of convening stakeholders from different domains and really enabling, helping develop and convene these stakeholders around a common vision for developing actionable information and putting Earth observation data and other types of information into work to help move toward a more sustainable, secure, and resilient future. And so while also addressing and filling key data gaps via efforts that are multilateral. And so it's really important to focus also on looking at how these outputs that come out of such partnerships are as interoperable as possible and connected as possible. So these are just some suggestions. Thank you.
Good day. My name is Zafar Sadiq Mohammed Gaus. I work for a company, which is a small company called Spatial Vision, based in Melbourne. Today, the knowledge or the experience that I'm going to share is more like Team Australia rather than just my company. Also, I wear some hats around the private sector as a board member of the World Geospatial Industry Council and also a member of the UNGGIM Private Sector Network. So my reflections will be sort of collectively from an Australian experience. The first successful experience, given the panel topic, is PPP. In Australia, we are quite proud to talk about the success of the Cooperative Research Centre program, which is a program that was initiated by the federal government. The whole concept behind the CRC program for spatial information is to more bring across government investment, private sector. When CRC for spatial information started, it had about 43 companies join, private sector companies, corporates, but also small to medium enterprises like my current company, but also 2 to 3 people companies. So there was no barriers around the corporate as well as small companies to join the CRC program. When CRC was started for spatial information, it had about $70 million funding in cash and kind. Then after its successful 7 years or round, it had a second round for another 7 years, where it received $180 million funding in cash and kind. And I'm one of the first PhD products through the CRCSI that I stand before you over here. Well, I sit before you here, where the public-private partnership was that cash and kind had helped develop about 50 to 60 PhD graduates going back into the commercial sector and government sector. But also today, the program that Geoscience Australia is leading around the data cube, fundamental research, the vector analysis around the vector database, some of the foundation concepts on the data cube was an outcome of that particular investment that's now being utilized. Also, what we see in the CRCSI program is after 14 years, the government stops the funding and CRC has to be standing on its own leg. Now that CRC has transformed into Frontier SI as a very successful self-sustained entity without funding from the federal government. So this is quite a good success story around the public-private partnership around the geospatial industry, which had different programs on spatial infrastructure, Earth observation, obviously, but I think it was about human capacity building, but also the outcomes of the CRC could be commercialized or fed back into the government supply chain. Another program that I would like to talk about is the Coordinated Imagery Program from the state of Victoria, where I come from. I'm from Melbourne. Previously, the councils had different set of specifications on capturing aerial imagery for different resolutions. There are a number of vendors who fly and take aerial photographs around 15 centimeter resolution for council purposes. They had varying standards. So what happened was to bring across, government took this initiative to bring all the private sector vendors as well as the councils as a state government initiative to talk about a collaborative approach that we agree on certain set of standards. At the same time, the same data is not sold back to different councils, capture ones and utilize many without affecting their margin. So an agreement was worked out in the Coordinated Imagery Program so that it's captured ones and councils utilize and it suits to the different specification. Although it was not a public-private partnership, but at least it opened a collaborative dialogue between the industry and government in a concentrated way. Also, what we are proud here in Australia is around the success of our Spatial Industry Business Association, which is once again a cluster of private sector companies which goes and talks to the government around the challenges that we have. It's not about just the business of making money, but also it's around how do we collectively work for the common good of the citizens. So you'd be surprised to hear that the 2026 agenda, that is the spatial agenda for the country, is led by the Spatial Industry Business Association in collaboration with CRCSI, where government participates. So about 500 people were consulted, mostly non-spatial people that are the clients of spatial, if I may put across, that they were able to give their views what the spatial industry needs to transform for Australia. So that's another example of a private sector business association able to talk to the government, able to bring the community and academia in order to turn and develop a roadmap for the next 10 years. And that's what's been reported every year in our National Congress, and community is eager to hear. The other points that I'd like to share from my personal experience, I had been very fortunate to work in Malaysia to help develop Malaysia's geospatial master plan, which is for about 10 years with about $250 million budget that had been developed. I've never seen a country invest so much into a sort of a master plan, and what Malaysia believes is geospatial underpins their export. And in that, they would have a view around government take a role of a regulator and would like the private sector to invest in this particular area. There was a change in government, but I don't know whether the new government is adopting to it, but it was quite a good experience. I worked there for 23 months leading with Malaysian consultants around, had a law background because you had to also pass law in the parliament in order to coordinate the 14 states and territories that they have and think about one geospatial architecture, irrespective of government or private, that they would agree upon a framework that they will believe. And it was totally a good experience on the whole community coming across and talking to the clients of Spatial that this is what we would do and this is what you would benefit. The last point is also, fortunately, I'm working in Saudi Arabia currently at the moment. Once again, the Saudi government is looking into the alternatives to oil economy, where you would have seen about the Vision 2030, about tourism, mineral exploration. But also there, it was noted that government would like to take a role of a regulator. They would like to get private sector more and more involved to invest in geospatial, i.e. in earth observation or survey or other branches of geospatial, so that government is able to make sure that there is a quality data being produced and the market forces determine what it needs to be. The last example I have from government of Victoria, once again, when the Victorian government 20 years ago used to maintain its cadastre and topography by itself. Then the government decided that they would like to go back to the industry and see what industry could transform. When government was doing the topographic management and cadastre management, it was about magnitude of about $20 million in total. Currently, the management cost of the cadastre and topography is about $3 million, and it is done by private sector. It's not that government is not efficient, but private sector is able to bring new methods, technology, and business models. And when government used to manage and maintain data, it used to be about sort of monthly updates to the topographic base. But now the private sector is managing it. They are able to do nightly updates because they have a business model. They could take advantage of their overseas offices, but also be able to produce current data. And I think it's also a good model where they are able to accept change in technologies and able to deliver. And who benefits? It's the citizen, it's the geospatial community benefits out of this partnership. So with these few thoughts, I would like to hand over the mic to my next panelist.
Thank you. Last but hopefully not means least. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I feel somewhat privileged and humble being an industry person, a pure play industry person from Microsoft, speaking at this panel. So my role at Microsoft is the National Technology Officer, which is probably bears a little bit of explanation since it's quite a unique role to Microsoft. What it essentially means is I hold a role where I take an external-facing advocacy role across public and private sector, across any opportunity that has long-term sustained value for the Australian national interest. So that's working with governments, regulatory bodies, and private industry to invest in and find opportunity where technology has a big impact. And so obviously, being here today and listening to these stories, there's a very close alignment between our strategy as a business and what this community of researchers and scientists and those in that space work on. What I want to do is I want to cover three things. I want to talk about why we're here. You know, what does Microsoft think we bring to the table? I'm going to talk about some of the things we've done to date and give you some context. And then in the context of the public-private IP learnings, I'll share with you some of the sense of the things we've seen. And I think when I get to that, please bear in mind that our experience around public and private IP is somewhat broader than just Earth observations. We deal across a whole range of elements of where we have to work across IP ownership. So I'll share what I can in that space. So for anyone who's dealt with Microsoft in the last 2 years or so in any meaningful way, you would come across our company mission or our mission statement, which we work to, which is essentially to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. That's the statement by which we live by. And the underlying story behind that is really to find ways to democratize access to artificial intelligence predominantly, but also the data and the tools and the communities that will build around that. So it's about, when we think about democratizing, we talk about how do we make our technology more available, but how do we also make the information that feeds that technology to create the innovation also more available. Now, we do that on our Azure platform, and in very simple terms, Azure is our cloud platform for network compute storage and other workloads in the cloud. But in the context of this conversation today in Earth observations, it's probably the most appropriate place to focus on is our investments around AI. And that really falls into two areas. The first I've touched on, which is that democratization of it. So we spend a lot of our time and resources as a company now building tools, services, and APIs and capabilities in our platform that take the functions of artificial intelligence, machine learning, the models, the inference, and all of the notebooks and the tools you need to make that happen, right down from the raw sort of hardware, machine learning, GPUs, devices, and FPGAs, all the way up to sort of software-delivered, software-as-a-service components to enable AI as a function of anyone's business. As much as we can, we try and democratize that service. So we're essentially trying to make our tools more broadly applicable to as wider audience as possible. The flip side of that is where we're trying to be more programmatic in our commitment to partnerships in research and innovation. And this is, as my colleagues have mentioned, is under the auspices of a program called the AI for Good program. So our AI for Good program launched around 18 months ago. It initially launched under three banners: the AI for Earth, AI for Humanitarian, and AI for Accessibility. And in recent 6 months, we've added a fourth pillar, which is AI for Cultural Preservation. Now, all four of those pillars are largely aligned to our desire to find ways for our technology to be married up with the right scientific and research and academic areas, plus the data that will drive the most rapid innovation and new thinking in those spaces. And it's a partnership. Yes, in some ways it's a funding program, but it's also really an opportunity for us to think about how do we, through the connections we have through universities and education established around the world, where we work in industry, but also where we work in the private sector, public sector, and bringing those communities together to kind of drive a better outcome. And I'm going to quote here from our letter to shareholders that went out just in the last month from Satya and from Brad, our leaders, and it reads as this: "We're committed to hosting the world's leading environmental data sets on Azure. These large data sets contain satellite and aerial imagery and require petabytes of storage. By making them available in our cloud, we will advance and accelerate the work of grantees and researchers around the world." So it is a solid commitment to maintaining the platform as a mechanism to propagate that data, but also to work closely with research and work with academia and bodies are associated with that to learn from that. So the AI for Earth pillar underneath that AI for Good program is the most applicable to this audience and this environment, in fact, and is the genesis for why I'm here and working with NASA and others to make use of that. So AI for Earth right now is a 5-year commitment plan and a $50 million investment from Microsoft to put into those communities to fund, yes, but also to empower research, innovation in the scientific community and find mechanisms where we can work together. So it's not just a process for us to give you cloud credits or put money into the ecosystem. It's about finding outcomes that we share a common belief on, is that will have a positive impact on the planet, bringing the research, the data, and our skilled resources together to accelerate that outcome. To date, we've done somewhere in the region of 400 plus grants. We have across 50 plus countries, so it's a global program with a massive impact. And more specifically, we've done a couple of pieces of work with NASA. So we have taken one part of the MODIS satellite data and have that now up in a platform we call Azure Open Datasets, which is an accessible set of APIs and tools to access that data. And more recently, we've just uploaded the harmonized Landsat Sentinel data to give you another common data set. And with that, we've also included sort of land mapping capabilities, so start looking at vectorization and classification of the data that's in the imagery data. So these are just the starting point, but this is where we're trying to head to, and this is the kind of workloads that we're building out. The differentiation here, because these things aren't necessarily new, we see a lot of this today in the cloud, and we see a lot of vendors and partners and competitors of ours doing similar things. So I want to highlight the way we think about it differently. So the number one thing is, we have an unwavering view on the intent and purpose of AI as a means to transform the world we live in. And we have a very positive perspective on that. We see AI as the tool that will help drive us as a society through research, innovation, to do better, to do more. And so the data sets that we bring into the Azure cloud and make available through the Azure open data sets are typically optimized around machine learning, modeling, and inference. So we tend to bring the data in, not just in its raw form, but provide the metadata and the classification data to enable you to quickly use that data in modeling and in machine learning inference to kind of use it in the most appropriate way as quickly as possible. And the second part is that partnership piece. So the AI for Earth program, as grantees apply for it and as we work with agencies, researchers, individuals, corporations, public and private sector who come to us with ideas, we don't just, as I say, hand out the money and wait for them to come back with something good. We actually want to partner with them, and we've done a number of significant projects. And on Thursday, I will be speaking in the industry track on a session on that AI for Earth program, and I'll actually share some of the actual outcomes we've built there in terms of solutions driven on that platform. So if I kind of think about and wrap this up into what have we learned from going into this public-private IP scenario, and again, this is, as I said, broader than Earth observation. We've done a lot of work in sort of capturing and using data sets and trying to bring public sector data sets in, but we've also worked with communities. So here in Australia, we work largely and heavily with our Indigenous communities to understand what value they can bring. So when we think about the different data sources and people that get involved in these kinds of projects and in these kinds of outcomes, it's industry, it's technical specialization, it's scientific and data research, it's Indigenous communities and others. And the single biggest learning has been for us is that we all speak a different language. And I've sat in this room and I've listened to everyone speak and I've understood probably about 27% of the words I've heard. But that's good, because if we're not here speaking about it and listening and learning, we're not going to get better. So for us, that has been, it's a patient process. You need to take time to listen and learn. But there are commonalities in the language, but I think we initially start to talk in a way that doesn't often make sense to each other. We've always sought, and we've learned through practice, we've always sought to engage our legal operation, our CELA team, which is our corporate external legal affairs, as early as possible into any conversations. And that's not to ensure that we kind of cover our own backsides and are legally protected. It's because often these conversations have nuances around the longevity of the data and the ownership, the partnership beyond the scope of the initial project and where does it go to. When we get into the constructs of AI, we're not talking about a fixed outcome, we're talking about a learning outcome that will change over time. And the reality is these have legal implications that we need to be clear about and be open about up front in that conversation. I would say, don't give up. We've seen a lot of, in our early days as we started this process of building our connections between public and private organizations, we saw a lot of started and failed attempts because we just didn't have the patience and time to get there. So don't give up. These things can be successful, but they often take time. And if I think about why we're doing it and what the value is for us, because as a cloud vendor, and I can only really speak for Microsoft, but of course there are many other cloud vendors and technology vendors engaged in this space, we fundamentally have a desire to build incremental value in our platform to help our customers digitally transform and create their future, their business. That intrinsic value of AI is absolutely based in data. We need good data to make our AI service come to life. Customers bring their data, but when we can augment customers' data with public data, not just geospatial data, but also societal data, humanitarian data, just historical data on traffic and road usage, a whole range of stuff. As we all probably understand, that meta layering of data provides the ability for you to point through that data and see something that just wasn't visible in a single layer of that. Data is ultimately the value for us. And so we embark on these partnerships with NASA and with other organizations because we know there's value in it for us, and we know there's value in it for NASA ultimately and for other organizations. So just being clear up front about what the expectations are. What do we want to get out of it as a commercial operating entity with arms that try to work into research, and public sector entities that just really want to contribute data and understand what that is. Being very clear on what you want out of it has been a really significant learning and real clarity around the start of that project. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Well, great. I guess our first thank you to the panel. So at this point, we have roughly about 15 minutes left. We've done some work ahead of time to go and make sure we've plotted a few people in the audience that have a lot to share as well. Though we have a great panel, we realize there's a lot of other people in the room that didn't have the chance to sit up there and speak, but have a lot of experiences too. So what we're going to do, as we open up to questions, we're also gonna put you on the spot a little bit too to share like what are some of the successes you've seen or some of the challenges you've seen or some of the big opportunities. So with your questions, also share some of the things you've learned along the way. So with that, I think we can open up. Anybody would like to go first? We know names that we can call as well. So sure, Miguel.
Miguel Roman, University Space Research Association. I want to talk about sort of the boundaries that we have to set up to ensure that the outcomes are possible, especially as we're relying a lot heavily on data. And there are some biases that we need to be careful about to ensure that what's being fed into a machine learning model does not make communities more vulnerable as we're preparing for adaptation strategies. This is something we're consistently concerned about in the science community. We're seeing cities being built in a manner that are pursuing gains in sustainability that do not match equal gains to job access to poor communities. So how are we policing ourselves in these PPP environments? Because we cannot just be too relying on the data itself. And what gets added, what gets excluded, ultimately can alter those outcomes significantly.
That's excellent point, and I sort of briefly mentioned it, but I didn't really dive into it, so I'm glad you raised the question. I think we largely understand that we build AI models based on historical data, but we also understand that historical data often reflects the inadequacies we have as a society over the last numbers of years. So there's no silver bullet to that problem. The way that we address it at Microsoft, and I'll let my other panelists provide any other insights, is we initially set up, we have an ethical framework which we established about 1.5 years ago, which was essentially a manifesto for what we believe to be the right and good approach, which was our ethical framework: accountability, transparency, fairness, privacy, security, and inclusivity as you just got to think about these things. As we've evolved that became from a framework to a set of principles, where do we stand on the boundary? What do we consider to be good accountability to bad accountability? How do we measure transparency? Where we're at today, and this is how we work with organizations like yourself and others who bring data to us, is we have a process called our Responsible AI Standard. Now, in the absence of regulatory frameworks in any governments and any kind of commercial industry rules that define how we do it, we've built a standard which is a multi-tier committee-based approach. So essentially, as we get the opportunity to work with somebody on a facial recognition piece of work or some data-driven outcome that will drive public services for social services, payment of Centrelink payments here in Australia, for example. In any model like that, what we initially assess it and we look for the issues of the core issues. Can we hold someone accountable for the data, and is the data process and the machine learning we're building there transparent in such a way that any reasonable person could understand it? And then we keep iterating on that. So we have multiple subcommittees that have specialization in fairness, inclusivity, diversity of thought and feedback in that. So it's an iterative process to try and feed through that data to understand what mistakes are we making. Are we setting ourselves up for an inherent bias-driven outcome, data drift that will take us down the wrong path? Today, it's as best an opportunity we have, which is a non-single entity, committee-driven approach, seated and owned by multiple diverse people of different backgrounds to kind of weed out the issues and challenges that we may see in that. But that's where we sit today. That's the process we've undertaken in our way to drive that. What it does point out, though, is one thing that is when we think about these public-private IP partnerships, and you bring data to the table, and we bring an innovation, a startup agency that wants to build something with that data, and we bring technology that's kind of the underpinning piece. It's important to ensure as much as you can a separation from a logical and a build-out model between the data, the technology, the software and the solution and the marketing and all of those pieces. The tighter you pull that together, it becomes harder to unpick it as and when other problems exist. But where you can do that, it's important to try and keep those boundaries between. Does anyone else have a comment on that?
I think from a community perspective, I think after defense, the largest spending is on cybersecurity, which I think everyone will agree. And this calls for the digital ethics. I think last month in Florence, we had the International Society of Digital Earth conducted symposia, And this was one of the hotly debated topic around what is our responsibilities. I think apart from individuals, I think the professional societies and associations, where in some countries do have a certification process. In Australia, we also have that. I think in US, you have the GIS Academy give this certification to GIS practitioners. I think apart from individual responsibilities, some of the governments have a regulator. I mean, most of the governments have a regulator role. And I think this topic needs to be brought into those practices, and certification on digital ethics is able to bring that accountability to individuals.
I'm going to speak from the government side and from the organization side. I think what is very important to take the confidentiality of the information. So for the statistics side, so we have to take care of this confidentiality and to take care, when you have the agreement with the private sector to produce some information, you have to take care of this information. In fact, from the statistical and the geospatial side at the United Nations, so we have a working group that has to be with the statistical and geospatial information standards to regulate this, the produce, the information and the data dissemination of that. This is very important, and for the countries, from the countries side, not from the private. So we have to agree in this regulation.
Great. So just a very quick comment before we go to the next question. So you probably noticed that Andy Swilla was listed as one of the panelists. So we heard from her earlier today that she got sick on her way here to Geo this week, so she wasn't able to make it here. I think she'll be here later, but I think I can say on behalf of all of us, we hope she feels better quickly. So please.
Hi, Lawrence Friedel with NASA Earth Science. Certainly not all partnerships work, and so I guess I'm wondering whether you have an example of where a public-private partnership perhaps struggled or maybe even failed. And I guess I'm wondering what happened and what do you think each side could have done better to prevent it?
It's how we communicate the success or failures. I think it's more the transparency to your stakeholders. Given the CRC example, as I said, that it had about 14 years, 7 + 7. When CRC came into the second year of its existence, where it did an independent review from a party and said and communicated to its stakeholders, that is governments, state governments, federal governments, small to medium enterprises, corporate sector, and academia, you invest $1 in CRC, you get $2.5 out, right? So this is not done by the CRC itself, but it did an independent review. That brought confidence in the stakeholders to reinvest in a PPP sort of a format. It's all about communicating and being transparent in process. Certain projects were not successful as the other projects are. So I think the challenge is about being transparent and communicating what works and doesn't work, and that news needs to go to the stakeholders as quick as possible so that the investors' directions change from the investment where they could see a failure. That would be the lessons learned through that PPP example.
I'll add one point on it. It's not so much a failure, but a lesson learned, which has been, I guess in the early days, as we started doing a lot more of this in the cloud with data or information or services coming from one side and public and private, we often worked very deeply and thought about how do we sort out the legalities between our two entities. Who owns what when and how will that live on, how will that persist? Often we're building services that impact a particular element of the community or society or impact some part of the world that was not a voice in that table. And that's probably one of the learnings we had very early on, particularly when, as I said, the focus has been for us on AI and building services that are engaging people in ways that they're not necessarily always comfortable with, has been that there are three pieces to that conversation. There's the owner of the data, the owner of the solution, but there's also the impacted audience. And that's been a big learning to make sure that that's a seat at the table as well.
Great. So I think we'll have time for one more question. Nathan?
Hi, I'm Nathan Eaton from NGIS here. A question initially for Lee, but happy to have comments from the rest of the panelists as well. Lee, you talked around a really strong partnership focus with the AI for Earth program that you're working on. How have you gone about creating opportunities for engagement with SMEs to really get input from specialist services?
Look, I guess my initial thought as you said that is are you seeing a challenge in that? Because I don't know that we have any, there's certainly no barriers or specific gates in that project that would exclude SMEs. Are you able to kind of give me a bit more color around what you mean by where the gaps have been or where the challenge has been?
How you actually... So a lot of the partnerships focus on quite large organisations, both public and private. How do you create opportunities for the smaller guys?
Okay. Look, I think I sort of appreciate where the challenge is coming. It is hard sometimes to get the kind of level of focus and view that you need inside a large organisation to drive that impact. What I found myself, and it's not sustainable, but it has been a case of sort of one-to-one, hand-to-hand combat scenarios. So I've worked with a couple of organisations. One I work with quite a lot here in Australia is a company called InDigital, which is a small Indigenous-based company building technology solutions for the preservation of Indigenous culture and enabling up-and-coming elders to hold on to that knowledge. It's not easy. It's not something we do very well programmatically. We are, as I said, we don't find a way to, we don't sort of have an exclusion around that, but the problem is, as you say, is that we as a large organisation, we're often not blinded to that process. What I would recommend, if you want to get engaged in that part of Microsoft, if you're looking to Microsoft in particular, then the AI for Earth site has a direct link to a community of people that is under what we've called, I think you mentioned at the end, Tech for Social Impact, which is really a part of our company that is focused on the smaller NGOs and smaller SMEs that are trying to make a difference and drive an impact through the information they have or the sector they work in. Outside of that, I'm happy to be the personal contact for you to do it because I have a personal passion of finding ways to do that, but sorry, it's probably not the answer you were quite looking for.
Great. So as an added bonus, we do have time for one more question, so please.
Okay. Allow me to make maybe not a question, but maybe to a remark and another perspective to public-private partnerships. My name is Ruud Grim from the Netherlands Space Office, and I'm coordinating a program for our Ministry of Foreign Affairs on food security. And in this partnership, in fact, we develop services for smallholder farmers. So what we see here in this community is a lot about research and about government sharing data and public entities to step in with data sets. In our program, we really want to deliver digital services for smallholder farmers via mobile phones, full call centers, and actually we have 25 examples running in 15 countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. So if anyone is interested to learn about how we approach public-private partnerships and the challenges, come to me. 2 weeks ago we announced that we already serving 1 million smallholder farmers so far. There are 500 million smallholder farmers in the world, and we really want to engage with everybody to reach that number. So come here, and I have some details for you on this leaflet. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our panelists for very nice insights and examples. I've learned a lot from this 1 hour, and thank you to the audience. Just a couple of points that I have noted, which is, of course, going to help us with the study that we are doing, as I said, about the geospatial knowledge infrastructure. There are some themes which are coming up for me, which, what I've learned is what has worked or things that we need to be careful about is trust and transparency, openness and exploration, communication and engagement, and capacity development and expertise sharing. So these are some of the themes that I have been able to capture that people have talked about or which has worked or something which didn't work and we have to be careful about when we are going for public-private partnership. Thank you once again to Jamie for being a very good partner in organizing this seminar, this roundtable. And once again, thank you for your inputs. And in case any one of you have any questions, further discussions with our panelists, please feel free to network with them.